Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. Grid Connections is the podcast where we explore the latest trends and innovations in clean energy, electric vehicles, and our electrical grid, tying all of them together. I'm your host, Chase, and in today's episode, we're speaking with Joseph Nagle, the head of corporate strategy at Pando Electric. If you're interested in the future of EV charging, particularly for multi-tenant facilities like apartments and condos, you won't want to miss this episode. Joseph shares how Pando Electric is revolutionizing EV charging by developing outlet-based systems designed to make electric vehicle charging more affordable and accessible for renters and property owners. We'll dive into their groundbreaking partnership with Peninsula Clean Energy, which has led to significant cost reductions in EV charging station installations, and discuss the importance of at-home charging solutions for accelerating EV adoption. Whether you're a property manager looking to offer EV charging to your tenants or an EV enthusiast interested in the latest industry trends, this episode is packed with valuable insights for you. Before we jump into the conversation, if you find this episode helpful, please share it with someone who might benefit from this discussion. And leave us a positive review on our podcast page. It helps us reach more listeners and keeps the conversation going. With that, enjoy.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Joseph, if someone isn't familiar with Pando Electric, can you share a little bit more about what you guys do and kind of the realm you guys work in?
It's a great question. We make socket-based EV charging systems that have been specifically designed for multi-tenant facilities like apartments and condos. We found that was a huge market that's being kind of ignored, and we wanted to be able to bring affordable charging solutions to that market so that people who live there can enjoy driving electric vehicles just as much as everybody else does.
Yeah, I think that's really a big challenge right now for the EV adoption. I think there's still a long ways to go, but as everyone kind of talks about in the news, we're obviously kind of going past that first adoption wave into the more of the mainstream. And there's a lot of people who want to get an EV, but may have challenges about plugging in at home if they are renting and stuff like that. So I think that's why I was so interested to speak with you today. I know there's a few different things you guys are doing, especially with partnership. So I know when we were talking about this beforehand, it was one of the things you want to talk about. So maybe let's just kick it off there and explore that partnership you're working on with Peninsula Clean Energy and kind of go from there for the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So Peninsula Clean Energy is a clean energy provider here in the San Francisco Bay Area. They're based out of San Mateo County. They are actually partnering with a large number of EV charging providers, not just Pando Electric. But the thing that they really did, which was very unique, was that they added in EV charging outlets to their incentive program. And that has made an absolute world of difference for EV drivers, multifamily property owners, and renters alike. The reason it's so important is that when you substitute in an outlet over a traditional EV charging station, you actually are able to drop the upfront costs pretty significantly. So like at Pando Electric, typically we see around a 70% drop in costs just by switching over to one of our outlets rather than a traditional system. And the reason that we thought that this was such a great program, not only because we obviously get the incentive funds, but because it actually opens up something that was kind of denied to a lot of apartment renters and apartment owners, which was the simple fact of charging from an outlet. And we found that most people who own an EV charge from an outlet anyway. And so by forcing the apartments to have like these more complicated EV charging systems, it wasn't actually very equitable for the EV driver themselves. Now we're able to bring in a charging solution that kind of fits for just about everybody. And so that's really the key thing here with Peninsula Clean Energy. And now that particular program is being replicated across the Bay Area through a lot of different clean energy programs. And we're also starting to see it trickle down into Southern California as well.
That's great. So when you say outlets, are we talking about level 1, level 2? Does it just kind of depend on the actual installation?
Yeah, so very good question. Pando Electric makes the only 240 volt, 40 amp level 2 charging outlet, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other outlet manufacturers out there who are doing lower power level 2, 20 amp level 2 outlets, or even level 1 outlets. So you do have a wider range, but we currently are the only ones that are doing the full scale level 2 solution.
That's great. And so looking at Peninsula Clean Energy's partnership, what are some of the kind of things that you going into it probably had some ideas of what it'd be. And then were there any things in particular that kind of coming out of that really stood out to you and some big takeaways?
I think the biggest takeaway that I had was just the forward thinking process of the group of people who designed that system within Peninsula Clean Energy. They really took a wide view of what was happening within the electric vehicle market rather than just copy paste what everybody else was doing. And so they took a little bit of a risk there because, especially at that time, I don't think that there was many EV charging outlet suppliers in the marketplace. Pando Electric certainly didn't exist yet, but now it's starting to grow and become more of a widespread thing here. So I think that in general is the most surprising, is just how forward thinking this whole thing was.
Interesting. So, kind of looking at that project and moving forward, what are some of the big takeaways if someone is listening and they're kind of looking to do something similar with their own project? Maybe some of the things to be aware of as they're going into the planning phase for a project like that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is efficiency, and it's more or less the efficiency of how that incentive money is being spent. And the biggest difference is the costs, right? So if you only get a pot of, say, $10 million, you can install quite a lot of traditional charging systems with that $10 million.
Yeah,
But if you're looking at a 70% cost reduction, you're also seeing probably a 70% increase in the number of charging stations that you can supply by just switching from traditional charging systems over to outlet-based charging systems. And that doesn't mean that the properties themselves don't get to choose anymore, because there's still incentive money for those traditional systems. So if they really wanted to, they could go put in, a very expensive, level 2 charging system because that's what they want. However, if they went with the outlets, they are just going to be a lot more. And so they're covering a lot more of their spaces. And that's something that's desperately needed out here in the Bay Area. We're rapidly approaching 40% of new vehicle sales as EV. So there needed to be some kind of a shift in policy in order to meet the needs of the growing number of EV drivers here.
for sure. And so, for someone listening, I know we've talked a little bit about this, but you're talking about 70% price reduction in that example. Like, why? How is that achieved?
That's the $48,000 question, isn't it? Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways. Number one is the hardware cost straight out of the gate, right? Pando Electric costs $499. That's $499, right? Like if you look at a comparable, I don't want to name names because I'm not that guy, but there are some systems out there, some of the biggest providers. You're looking at $5, $6, $7, $8,000 for the same output of the station. So right away, you're looking at a pretty dramatic cost. Now, on the back end of that is the infrastructure side. So traditional systems have to do what's called a home run from the charging station back to the panel. That means you have to run your conduit from the station all the way back to the electrical panel.
Right.
With a outlet-based system, you can actually daisy chain them together. So instead of running each one individually back to the panel, you can daisy chain them together and then just run one back to the panel. So that's another way of reducing the infrastructure costs. You're cutting down a lot on the copper wiring that's going in, and 6 and 8 gauge wire is relatively expensive, and unfortunately copper prices keep going up.
Right.
So being able to reduce those costs brings it down more. And then on top of that, if you leverage a power management system similar to what Pando Electric is doing, you're able to actually install more stations on infrastructure that could not support it. So you're cutting out more infrastructure again, which again reduces the cost. So when you combine all of those factors together, that's how you're getting that 70% cost reduction.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, just with what you're talking about, it sounds like a big part of that 70% reduction, I'm sure, is also in the labor side of it, from having to run much less conduit and then also the panel upgrades. Is there anything else from the labor side that your technology really helps save with?
You hit the nail on the head. It's the labor side of, if you have a straight line conduit run, that's the easiest you're going to get. And that's pretty rare. Most of the time you
Right.
have to bend it around a wall or something. And if you've ever handled, 6 gauge copper wire, it's not something that's super malleable. It's going to take a little bit of time and a lot of strength to bend it into the correct shape to get it around a corner. And if you have to do like a zigzag pattern through, a complicated garage setup, that can actually add quite a lot of additional labor costs to a job that may be pretty simple.
Now, with daisy chaining these together, is there a limit to how many you can do at one installation, or is it kind of also determining on what maybe the panel it's going into is?
Yeah, technically there's no limit, but you don't want to daisy chain like 100 together. That wouldn't
Right.
be very efficient. So there's like an efficiency balance that you need to kind of come to. At Pando Electric, we don't do any more than 5 on a single chain.
Okay, gotcha.
The reason is you can't have all of those pulling all at the same time. So you're going to have to shut a few of them off and come up and bring a few of them online. And that's what the power management is designed to do, to balance that load out so you're not blowing the breaker. So you don't want to go crazy with it. So if you
Right.
tie it back to a 40 amp breaker and you have 100 of these on there, you're getting basically no energy anyway. So you want to be able to balance that correctly so that every single vehicle that's attached to that chain is going to get a full charge by morning.
That's great. And it sounds like there's also a very large kind of software layer to this component to make a lot of this work, especially when the way you're talking about it, plugging into existing panels and avoiding those upgrades.
Yeah, there's that aspect of the software, the power management aspect, and then there's also actually the more complicated one is the billing and reimbursement services. This is something that a lot of companies have always struggled with, and they're
Yeah.
constantly. It's not because of the ideas being bad; it's actually the regulations not really matching up with current technologies or being vetted correctly. And on top of that, every state's different. But we have a built-in commercial grade meter into each one of our outlets that's monitoring and tracking all of the energy that's used, and it's billing each individual driver for their usage. So you have to actually be able to tie individual sessions to individual drivers and then be able to accurately bill them and then reimburse the property for the energy that's used.
So, as an EV driver, how would that work? Do I pull up and then it's kind of I swipe a card, or well, it sounds like it's kind of a little more going on in the back end than that.
Yeah, so it depends on the provider. So with Pando
Gotcha.
Electric, you're going to come in, you'll have a mobile app that you'll come and scan our QR code that initiates a little bit of a Bluetooth handshake, and then you can start your charging session. So it just activates the outlet. The outlet says, okay, I can provide you energy now. And then because you've activated it through your phone, it shares a special code that knows that you are the EV driver that's using the station at that time. And so that's how it's accruing all of the energy. Now, there's other systems out there. Some companies use just a credit card system. Some companies use, an NFC card. But we found that the easiest way is to just use your phone and scan the QR code.
Gotcha. And are you seeing? I mean, I'd kind of imagine this is the probably most common is people are charging for these installations. But I'm just kind of curious if you've seen any uh, apartments or kind of installations where they almost bake that into the price of the rental and just say, "Hey, you get free charging," but really and it just simplifies the whole kind of billing part of it.
A lot of apartments do that initially.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of our business right now is to go into apartments and replace the quote unquote dumb outlets that they've installed, because when they started doing that, they didn't really account for how much energy electric vehicles actually use. And all of a sudden, their energy bills started to skyrocket, and they couldn't
Yeah.
figure out why until we come on and we say, oh well, you're just using these outlets. EVs use a huge amount of energy every single year. Most likely, what's happening is it's pushing them into higher energy pricing tiers, and so then their energy prices just start spiraling upwards. So even if they tried to offset that by saying, oh, we're going to charge you another $100, $200 a month for your rent, that might not actually cover your actual energy costs because it pushes you into a higher tier. Your energy rates go up, and then it's just a spiraling problem. So being able to put in like a power management system that stops charging before it gets over that tiered threshold and then just pushes it off into lower pricing tiers, that's how you're able to kind of, as a property owner, protect yourself from that situation. And so you do need to have like a smart solution in place to prevent that from happening.
Now, do you get around a lot of that by like time of use tiers, or is it
Mhm.
also just depending on the utility? There's just total volume of electricity being used that does kind of push some of these apartments up.
Great question. It really depends on your area.
Yeah.
I have seen places that do both. So it's more common out here in California, especially commercial properties. They do have time of use that goes into it, but then they also have tiered pricings based on volume. And because multifamily housing is technically classified as commercial, that is something that they have to be very mindful of.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit more about kind of the challenges and solutions that Pando Electric provides in multifamily, since you brought that up. So I think probably a lot of our listeners are uh, probably in single family or like condos, but let's kind of maybe unwrap and take a little step back and just kind of talk about the use case for Pando Electric in multifamily and how that works just for level 2 in general. And then we can kind of talk a little bit more about the challenges and some of the solutions you guys provide for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the biggest things that you have to take into account when you're looking at a multifamily housing is there's a delicate balance going on within that community on whose needs you need to adhere to. So the EV drivers, they just want access to energy. And they want to be able to have that access anytime, day or night, so that they have the peace of mind when they come home. There's going to be an EV charger there that's
Right.
open and ready and working for them. The community at large, they want to have equal access for everyone. So they don't want some people getting special access or having to or being able to just park their car all day and night in the one EV charging spot. They want everybody to have the same access. And then the property owner, they have the most complicated kind of need, which is they don't want to be the ones paying for your electricity.
Right.
I always bring this up. I'm like, would you expect your landlord to fill up your car with gas? And the answer is always no. And so, it's the same problem. They don't want to be filling your car up with energy either. So they want to be able to recoup the cost of energy. And then sometimes they want to make a little bit of return on their investment because the infrastructure that they had to put in is rather expensive. Even with incentive
Yeah.
funds, sometimes it gets pretty expensive. So you have to be able to balance all of those things when you're bringing in a charging system. And that's what's made this market particularly difficult, especially on the front end side of cost. The front end capital expenditures that you're going to need to bring in EV charging stations without incentives are often really, really onerous, right? Like when I worked, I was a first hire at EverCharge. When I worked there, our upfront costs were on average $4,000 to $6,000 per station installed. So if you can think about that, like
Yeah.
10 of those is going to cost you like 50 grand, and
Right.
that's if you have enough power. That's not, hey, I've got enough energy, I can add in 10, $50,000 straight away. Like that's expensive. So with Pando Electric, same scenario, we can probably drop that down to like 1 to 1.5 per station. So you're seeing like a pretty significant
Yeah.
reduction there. And then the more complicated things get, if they're power limited scenarios, there's no panel space, those types of scenarios, that's where we start to see those 70% deep cuts, because we're able to daisy chain, we're able to use our power management system to install more stations than would have been able to. So you don't have to bring in, which are the more expensive things, new transformers, new panels, which are, 20, 30, $50,000
Right.
just for the one thing. So that's how you're really getting to make the cost more comparative to EV charging at a single family home.
Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting thing too. Is obviously what you're kind of talking about is not just going into a multifamily home, but it is kind of upgrading a multifamily home. So, can you explain maybe some of the challenges? And do you see that this is usually done when maybe there's being some sort of like retrofitting an older building? That's when they start looking at kind of these updates, or what is usually kind of in your experience what motivates a building owner to kind of bring you guys into this process?
I think the first thing is usually at this point in the life cycle of Pando Electric, we're brought in when the traditional systems are still too expensive. So
Gotcha.
a lot of our properties that we get today are people who've already looked around at your charge points, your ever charges, Blink, and they're just, this is still too expensive. So we need something a little bit more cost effective. They call us. That's typically what we're seeing right now. The other big issue here is that every single property is completely different. So people will often ask us, "Oh, why can't you just give me a general quote?" And I'm like,
Right.
"Well, it's pretty difficult because I don't know your panel situation. I don't really know how old your electrical infrastructure is. I don't know how much power capacity you have. I don't know what the garage layout is, so I don't know the runs. Like it just keeps going and going and going. So you really can't understand what's happening there until you get boots on the ground and you go there and look at the panel, at the situation, and then you can give a more realistic quote. So that's kind of still one of those things where people always ask, and it's like, I can't tell you, I don't know until I go there and see it myself.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up, because that was very similar to the issues like when I worked in the solar industry, that people always want this kind of flat number, and you could kind of say, yeah, it's this, but it could be plus or minus 100%.
Right. Yeah.
Either we can't do it or it could be way more expensive. But that is kind of interesting. So doing these upgrades and kind of these improvements to the buildings, is it, and I think the reason I'm asking this is you brought up some of those other competitors. Some of them approach it as you buy it, you own it, you maintain it. Does Pando Electric kind of, once they've done the installation, is it the property owner, or do you guys offer any sort of kind of maintenance plan or stuff like that? Because I know a lot of EV chargers we've run into have definitely had over their lifespan issues where they get broken and then they're kind of never fixed again.
Yeah, that's actually one of the biggest selling points that we have as a company is the fact that because it's an outlet, it basically carries no maintenance. I always ask people, I'm like, do you ever maintain an outlet? Do you ever sit there and be like, oh no, my outlet broke? Like, it's pretty rare.
Yeah.
And for us, because the nature of our hardware is so affordable, if it does actually break, and the only time that ever happens if someone came in and bashed it with a hammer, it's actually a pretty easy fix for us. We can just ship out a new unit. It's $500. It goes on the wall the next day. Pretty simple. So one of our biggest selling points to property owners is the fact that you're not going to have to maintain these. You don't have to worry about someone coming in and vandalizing and like snipping cables to steal it for the copper, because there is no cable. It's just an outlet.
Right.
So those are the types of things that we've actually like built into the product itself to make sure that there is a long-term play. The other thing is that we've tested these outlets to last 5,000 cycles. So under our current usage, that actually means it'll last 40 years before you'll need to replace it. So you've got time to figure out a new solution.
Yeah. There might be all sorts of things between now and then.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And so that's really interesting, because what the model you guys are kind of following is actually more of what you see in Europe.
Right.
And I think it does make a lot of sense. And is that kind of intentional when you were kind of looking at the research of essentially you bring your own cable, and then that kind of minimizes some of the ongoing maintenance like you're talking about, and then also just kind of puts the responsibility on the actual EV owner?
I think that was more of like a bonus perspective of the European model. We didn't go out to intentionally copy that model. The reason that we made outlets is we actually went and looked at what single family homeowners are doing.
Gotcha.
Most single family homeowners are going in and just putting an outlet in, or using an outlet that's already there to charge their vehicle. And so it just boiled down to a simple equity problem, right? Like, if we want people to all enjoy EVs the same way, they should be able to charge from a simple outlet rather than having to rely on these very complicated, complex charging systems that we've seen so many articles, and they're all more or less true. I know people like, oh, it's all FUD, it's all lies. It's true. Like, some of these charging stations, they do break. They do just sit there for weeks and weeks, maybe months on end before they're actually fixed. And that's a big problem. If you went and rented an apartment because you like the area, you like the apartment, and hey, big bonus, it has an EV charging station. And then the first day you get in there, it breaks down. And then for months and months on end, it's just never working. That's got to be really frustrating. And so we wanted to be able to resolve that issue. And the best way to resolve those issues is to not go more complicated. It's actually go more simple and bring in something that's just a simple outlet. You plug in. If anything were to break, we can just replace it real quick. Like, everything should happen within 24 hours is kind of one of our mottos. So if your cable breaks, you can go to Amazon and get one shipped overnight. If our station breaks for whatever reason, we'll replace it. No problem. Just give us a call. We'll send a new one out, and you can swap it out yourself. Like, that's kind of where we're trying to get to bring in a more equitable solution so that everybody's having more or less a shared experience on how the EVs work. Similar to a gas car, everybody knows they go to the gas station. It's not like some people have to go to a special gas station, right? It's everyone goes to the same place. So it's the same kind of conundrum that we're trying to solve for.
So for the actual outlet, does and my apologies for not checking this previously, but you said it's a 240 volt, 40 amp. So does that mean it's a 1450 outlet that the EV driver actually plugs into?
Yeah, it's a NEMA 1450 plug.
Yeah.
The reason we went with that was it's the most common plug type for level 2 charging. It's more or less a universal standard at this point.
Right.
And then on top of that, something that often gets forgotten about is the NEMA standard's been around for over 100 years. It's not going anywhere. And the reason I bring that up is because we've already seen a shift in connector type from J1772 to now we're going to NACS. And we don't know what's going to happen in there. We're seeing a transition, but some of the automakers aren't really moving. And so it is causing a bit of a headache for people who are purchasing EV charging stations. Like, well, which one should I go with? Well, if you went with Pando Electric, it doesn't matter. We're using a NEMA standard plug. Most vehicles today come with that option, or they come with that charger in their vehicle on the day they purchase it. So it's really easy to just keep using the same plug type rather than trying to figure out what kind of new connector type is going to come out.
No, that's a really good point. So as the different charger types, or it doesn't really matter what kind of EV it is, excuse me, someone can kind of actually bring the right charging thing for their car and just make it work pretty quickly.
Right, and it goes back to that 40 years, right? So they last 40 years. So we need something that's also going to be like relevant in 40 years, not this connector type is going to shift over to something different, right? And a good example that I always use is like I'm a bit of a gym rat. I go to the gym and I always see like the old iPhone docks that you could plug in an iPhone that, nobody owns that type of iPhone anymore, but they're still on the treadmill and it makes it useless. And I'm like, well, they didn't really think that one through, did they? They could have had a different system to plug in or work with that particular treadmill. And that's kind of what we're looking at with EV charging. Like, I don't know what connector type they're going to invent 40 years from now, 30 years from now, 20 years from now. I don't know. Maybe Elon's going to come out with something crazy and new. But for us, it doesn't matter, right? Like, it's a NEMA standard plug. That's not going to go anywhere. And until wireless charging becomes more viable, which maybe in the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's still just, this is the best solution that you have to put into any kind of a building, not just an apartment, but also your home.
Yeah, so that is kind of interesting, bringing up the outlet, especially the NEMA 1450 specifically, because we have seen, in the case of some single family homes, people plug it into to which one they have, and those outlets were really never designed for repeated usage. They're usually designed for like once every 10 years or something. Somebody plugs and unplugs their dryer, and then that's kind of what it's for. Whereas like daily usage, you can see a lot of damage for those. And I'm sure you guys have kind of figured that out, but I was just kind of curious, in that kind of design, when you're going through that, like what are there any things that are just kind of interesting that stood out when you were building it to be kind of made for that 40-year lifestyle, or what you guys did to really make sure that it wouldn't have those issues like some of the 1450 outlets are at home?
Right. So it's almost an uninteresting answer because the only way you test that is you make a machine that just plugs in and unplugs a charger endlessly until the socket breaks.
So it's just a robot kind of plugging and unplugging it multiple times.
I have a video of a robot just in and out, in and out, in and out for hours, and that's what it's doing until we pull it off the wall and say, oh, look, it broke at X number of cycles, and that's all you're doing. But you are correct. Like, if you went and said, I'm just going to solve this on my own, I'm going to go down to the Home Depot and just buy a dryer plug. That'll work if you leave your charger just plugged in forever. Yeah, you're good to go. Well, actually, I take that back. You want to buy an industrial plug for that. Because you need clamp force for the downforce, because charging cables are heavy, and so if that's sitting there hanging, pulling on that outlet for a decade, it's going to wear out the connector just the same.
That's what's really interesting is people go to Home Depot and they'll be the one that's like, oh, this outlet's $3, I want $30. Why would I pay for $30? It's exactly the same, right? And I think, unfortunately, there have definitely been some lessons learned the hard way about that, but that there's a big reason for that discrepancy, even though it's not, in the scheme of things, that huge of a price difference.
Right. And I think that's one of those things I've seen it a bunch with a lot of my friends who have convinced to buy EVs, and they have their, garage set up, and I go in and I'm like, oh my God, like you can't, they have, some very underrated extension cord that's going to the wall, and you can feel it. It's hot. And I'm like, I'm surprised your house didn't burn down, because you shouldn't be doing this. Like those types of situations, people do need to be aware of. I think it's more just general public education, and which is why like I love this podcast. You get to help educate people.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's actually
Yeah.
funny. I haven't shared this with anyone yet. I've been meaning to post something about this. We're actually, I was living in Bend, Oregon, but we just recently moved, and so we're in a rental before we find something we kind of want long term in Hood River, Oregon, and which is kind of a little windsurfing town. And the rental we're in, and it has a 2-car garage, but it doesn't have a 240 or anything. It's literally a wall outlet. Or 120 wall outlet. So I've been charging our Model Y that way. And it seemed like the electrical was fine, but I was just always a little skeptical. It's a little bit of an older house. And I'd never seen this happen before, but I go in one morning and on the EVSE, there's essentially it'll just be kind of glowing green where it's like the Tesla name, and it just goes like from left to right, kind of a green thing. And this time the T is red, but it kept glowing green. I was like, that's really bizarre. What is going on? And when I got in the car, it had said that the EVSE had detected that the outlet was getting warm. And so it brought it down from 12 amps down to 6 amps and has been charging at a measly 6 amps on 120. So it's like pretty much barely half a kilowatt. And obviously not ideal, but I just thought that was really cool. And I'd never seen one be I mean, it kind of makes sense for them to have a heat sensor, but that was just something that happened to me recently that I thought was pretty funny, but goes to exactly that. Like, how many times did something have to go wrong before they realized this would be a good thing to have and to design it this way? And
I
obviously a
think
software layer is so important in these kinds of things to realize that.
why 100%. And I think that's kind of why, even with all the angst around what's happening with Tesla, that's why Teslas are still the
Yeah.
best EVs. They've thought through all of these problems already. It's not something that they're like, oh shoot, like we have to now make a thing to add that in. It's already done, right? If you had like a Ford Mach E, I don't know if that feature exists. I don't know
Right.
if it's on like any of the Hyundai, like I don't know. But I know for a fact that Tesla's got that stuff already baked in, and that's why they sit at the top of the EV chain, because there is no competitor right now for what they're doing.
Well, I mean, and I think you could say this not just at them, but maybe more at the startups too. Is like inherently, even if you're a smaller company, if you have engineers focused on one kind of product style versus that, and hybrids and combustion engine, it does really help you keep focused on the mission to think about these things instead of being kind of. And obviously, their engineers are focused on one product, not really hopping around a lot. But it's just kind of something throughout their complete supply chain they're thinking about and dealing with, which it's I think those other companies will get there, but it's just you're right. It's just interesting to see like every now and then I just see something where it's so easy to hear the news like, oh, all these competitors are catching up and doing something, but then you look at just the EV focus like startup companies and realize just being focused on that one product style and instead of trying to do multiple styles vehicles really does give you a leg up.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of the old school auto OEMs are really doing themselves a disservice by not just going full force into EVs and saying, okay, like we're just going to start warehousing people over on this EV side, which you're starting to see more and more of. Like Ford is being very like forward thinking on what they're doing, but there's a lot of catch up that has to
For sure.
occur before they're even going to come to match Tesla or Rivian or anything like that. So there's a lot of catch up time that's going to happen. The one thing that I'll give the OEMs is that they know how to manufacture vehicles really,
For
really
sure.
well. So that's their like major. We
Yeah.
can produce, millions of these things, and they're all going to be of similar quality. While a lot of the startups are still struggling through
For sure. It was really interesting. I was at the Electrify Expo actually this past weekend in San Francisco.
Oh no
And it
way!
was just really interesting to see the number of automakers there and kind of just naturally where, I mean, obviously Tesla had a Cybertruck there. So I think that had some of the interest. And obviously they're made in the Bay,
Yeah,
or at least most of their vehicles. And so it was just wild to see like how long the lines were to look at the Tesla. It was really a Tesla and Rivian, and then there's some other automakers there. So how it felt. But so I guess one of the things is we're talking obviously about electric vehicles, and we were kind of mentioning there's other types of vehicles. Is there anything to be aware of or any issue that, let's say I have a plug-in hybrid? I'd imagine that could just work just as easily with this
Yeah.
as it would be kind of like for those people who are trying to take the leap but not completely convinced of going fully electric yet.
Yeah, anything can get plugged into that outlet as long
Right.
as it has an EMA 1450 plug. And you can even use an adapter as well.
Gotcha.
So that's really not much of an issue. My biggest issue with the plug-in hybrid owners is a lot of them don't plug them in at all.
No, I know. That's a very
So,
common topic on this
uh,
podcast for sure.
yeah, so that would be my one thing is that I'm not too worried about that because it seems like they don't care about the plug-in aspect of it, which I don't know why they bought the vehicle in the first place then, but
Right.
to each their own.
No, for sure. So we've obviously been pretty focused on what you guys are doing, and it is great to see on, especially in the multifamily area. But I'm kind of curious. I take it you have an electric vehicle. I guess we haven't clarified that, or what are you driving currently?
So I live in San Francisco, so I have street parking. So I actually don't have a car. I drive an electric scooter, like a Vespa.
Oh, gotcha.
that I
Okay,
get around.
great.
So it has a removable battery, so just bring it
Yeah.
in the house and charge it up. It's actually charging right now. And the nice thing about that is to get around San Francisco on a scooter is vastly superior than a car or any other method
Oh,
of
for
transit.
sure.
California lets you do lane splitting, and so it's quite fun during rush hour to just cut straight to the front of the line. But in the future, I'll probably, if I end up moving, of course, I'll probably end up with a more normal style EV.
Yeah. No, I mean, I totally get that. I lived in the Bay Area for a while. I was mostly down in Palo Alto, where it's still a little more suburban. It's easier to have a car, but like being in San Francisco proper, especially with off-street parking, I mean, that's about as good of a situation as you can have. And it's like that and Manhattan are kind of some of the cities where it's almost more of a pain in the butt to have a car than a benefit.
Yeah, well, not only that, my other concern was vandalism.
For sure.
As much as I don't want to like bring up the stereotype of the city, there was a period of time. It seems to be settled down now, but there was a pretty significant period of time where if you left anything in your car, anything, the windows are going to be smashed, and so I'm like, I don't want to put.
There's no windows to smash on a Vespa. That's the upside.
No, there is not.
So, no, that's great to hear. So, actually, I guess I'm curious about that. What kind of range does it have?
It says it has 40 miles, but that's a lie.
Yeah.
I'm also a bigger guy. I'm 6'1", I'm 200 pounds. So I'm sure if it was, 5'5", 150 pounds, it would go a lot further. But, and then the other problem is that it has a definite power loss to the motor after like 50% battery life. So
gotcha.
Going up the big hills here, if I have 100% battery, no problem. I'll be cruising. But once it goes under 50%, it's actually pretty painful. Yesterday, coming home from the gym, I was going over a hill, and I think I was going up that hill 8 miles an hour. Like the lower it gets, the slower it gets. So it's kind of one of those situations where like that particular subset of electric vehicles, they need to boost it up a little bit. I do see like in warm weather environments could be a perfect solution for mobility, but it's still got a long way to go.
Well, that's interesting. So is it just plugged into just a regular 120 outlet at home and then just kind of just charge it overnight then?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, I guess we could talk about level 1 charging, but I guess I would be kind of curious about that and your thoughts on just level 2 charging in general, and maybe some of the interesting trends you're seeing from kind of where you are in the company, and also just in the Bay Area in general. It's always kind of interesting how, like you're kind of a perfect example where it's like people always think of the Bay being this like, oh, everyone's got an electric car and all this stuff, but once you live there, you definitely realize there's definitely areas where it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And there can be a lot of challenges. And even going, when I was down in the South Bay, like going into the city, sometimes it is really hard to not just find parking, but to even find level 2 charge. I mean, I'm sure that's changed a little bit, but I'd just be kind of curious on your thoughts around that.
Yeah. I think number one, I'd say that level 1 is fine. People tend to be, oh, it's too slow, it'll never work. And like, it actually gives you, just enough to cover your daily driving needs.
Yeah.
The thing I always tell people is most of us grossly overestimate how much we actually drive.
For sure.
We equate time in the car to miles driven, which is definitely not true.
See,
So you might be sitting in traffic for an hour and a half, but you probably only went 30 miles and you didn't realize that it just
right.
wasn't that far.
Sadly,
So
yeah, that's always the worst part of it.
yeah, like that's something that even myself, I'm like, oh my God, I must have been driving all day today. It's, 70, 80 miles. And it's like, oh no, you only went 40 miles down the road.
Right.
Not that far. That's number one. I would say number two, for the Bay Area, we are seeing a lot more thoughtfulness play out here. I'm seeing, like, if I use California in general, there's a big split between Northern California here in the Bay Area and Southern California down in LA, San Diego. And I think it really does boil down to at-home charging.
Mm-hmm.
I think up in the Bay Area, there's better programs. We have Peninsula Clean Energy, like we spoke about, doing the socket-based charging as incentives for multifamily. And that's having like a huge effect on the number of people being able to get charging at home. And I'll use an example. We just did a project out in Woodland Creek. It's actually on our website right now at pandoelectric.com. And we continue to talk about it. It actually got a lot of press. We were able to bring in 90 EV charging stations, one for every single unit in a 90-unit condo. So everybody gets a charger. We were able to do that for $405 per station, fully installed. That means that's all each individual resident had to pay to get a charging station installed. That increases the property value, by the way. So even if they don't have an EV, it increased the property value of their property, of their condo. And we were able to do that because of Peninsula Clean Energy and their incentive program. And so we're seeing like a big difference. And one last thing I'll bring in is that they looked at the most famous charging supplier, not named Tesla. I won't name them. You can think of who they are. They looked at them first, and they could bring in 8 of those charging stations before they spent all of the money that we spent. Wow. So we put in 90, they're going to put in 8. And that's the difference. And the reason I use the example of California and Northern California versus Southern California is we're starting to see in Northern California, the public chargers, specifically the Tesla superchargers, are not overburdened.
Yeah.
You can come in most of the time. There's no line. You just come in, park, and charge. In LA, different story. You come in, you're going to have to wait. And sometimes that wait is going to be really long and really painful. I don't have the data to back this up yet, but I will bet my last dollar that it has everything to do with charging at home. And because there's just not enough charging at home down in LA yet, that's the problem.
Well, and I think I've definitely seen this. I even experienced this firsthand in the Bay Area recently. I kind of had a funny thing. When I flew in last weekend, I got an Uber, and the guy, first thing he asked me was, "Hey, can I go charge?" And I wasn't even thinking. I was like, "Oh," and maybe I was just coming off the flight and had been delayed. I was like, "Sure," and he literally, as I'm in the back of the Uber, pulls into a charger, a supercharger, and just charges there. Which I was like, oh, okay. I guess I'm getting billed for this. That's a fun twist. But I think really it was just one, and he did need the charge because I looked over at his screen and it said he had 4% range. But then two, I think it was kind of an easy way for him to get a smoke break, it looked like. But what's really interesting to me is I completely agree with you. It's like it's hard to have as much as I like to have the facts, everyone I've talked to, and even just personal experience anecdotally, and even though that was in the North Bay, like a big part of it is, especially in Southern California, just DC fast charging is so overwhelmed. And a big part of that is due to Uber drivers and other kind of rideshare drivers. And one of the things I've definitely talked about with people is like a lot of these companies, I mean, it's no different than like taxi companies. They have their own commercial gas filling stations. Right. And I think we're in kind of a rough transition period with EVs, but that also needs to, I think, be solved, whether it's Uber or whichever rideshare company has their own charging station specifically for them, so it doesn't kind of jam up some of the normal chargers for people trying to use, especially if they don't have level 2 charging at their home. But I think that's why I was really so excited to talk to you today, was to really get more companies like yours get awareness for it, because that is really what's having a big impact, is not having those places where you can charge on a level 2 to really make sure that day to day you don't have to go to a fast charger. Because there's definitely a place for it, but for the majority of the time, it really should be for people kind of going through town or visiting. And if you can use a level 2 and you're not on a road trip, honestly, I just think it's a much better experience anyways, just plug in and walk away.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you can be hopeful about is that I don't think Uber or Lyft are going to build their own charging stations.
Right.
Not their MO.
Yeah.
I think the thing that is going to change, and I hope that you got a chance to see this when you were in the Bay Area in San Francisco, is that Waymo is going to completely destroy that industry. Most people here use Waymo now. They're not really using Ubers unless Waymo's overburdened. So those cars do have their own charging depots.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I think that's where we're actually heading for. The taxi cab type companies is it's going to be all autonomous anyway. And they'll just go back to a centralized location on their own and charge up there. I do believe 100% that people need to be educated about the DC fast model.
Yeah.
People still get really tied to the idea of DC fast and gas stations, same thing.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to do. And it's like, yeah, that's not actually how this should work. And the thing that I've actually gotten people to understand better is when I describe it like with your cell phone, right? Like when my cell phone's, running low, yeah, I'll find a public outlet or something. I'll charge it from that public outlet. But most of the time, like the majority of the time, I just plug it in at home. And it doesn't matter if it's at, 90% or 1%. When I'm going to bed at night, it's getting plugged in. And then in the morning, it's 100%. And that's how if I look at internal data from Pando Electric or even my time at EverCharge, like it was always the same. It was people come home, they plug in, they go out with 100%. That's what they want, or they're capping it at like 80, 90% just to save the battery. But that's what they're doing most of the time, rather than waiting until it bleeds down to zero and then running around trying to find a station. Like that sounds like crazy to me now, but before with a gas card, that's what you did. And so we have to change people's mindset, and that's just going to take time. We've been, fueling our vehicles one way for 100 years, and now you're asking everybody to like rethink how that's actually working. And so that's kind of going to be a little bit of a bumpy transition, I think.
I think that's actually for one of the things I want to ask you about was kind of like scaling and looking forward. So kind of talking about the future, can you share with us kind of what Pando Electric is looking at and kind of how your team is thinking about it?
Oh boy, you're going to end up getting me in a lot of trouble with my boss if I say the wrong things. Startup life. You'll have to be a little secretive about what you're looking at
Fair,
and what you're going to do next. But I will say, look at the industry in general, and I'll say there's a lot of information out there that's what's going to happen, right? So you're seeing a lot of press like, oh, the grid can't handle all these electric vehicles. That's true. That is absolutely true. If I were to snap my fingers right now and every vehicle on the road turned into an EV, we'd have some problems. Good news, I can't do that, and it's probably not going to happen for quite a long time. So we have some time to figure this out. But in the meantime, there's a lot of interesting ideas around grid stability solutions. You can do V2G. I don't see a huge platform for that for like a consumer, but for maybe those the taxi cars, that makes sense. But like if you're going to look at grid stability, how do I balance out the load that the building is going to draw? Like I want to make sure that I'm not always taxing at the highest time of use rate. So you can bring in batteries to stabilize the grid and act as like almost a reservoir for the vehicles to pull off of. So I can pull in energy when it's being generated for cheap, middle of the day, solar, wind, whatever, store it until it's going to be used for an EV. You can help balance out the load that way. There's a lot of really interesting things around like smart panels. I love what Span is doing. There's a lot of really interesting things there to like add intelligence into our grid. And that's kind of where I'm seeing not just Pando Electric going, obviously, because I mentioned it, but a lot of the EV charging companies are starting to look more at, grid stability solutions and power management solutions for whole building energy loads rather than just the vehicles. And I think that's where we're going to end up next is properties are going to start to realize they have a lot of control in terms of power, and they're going to be able to start to do some really interesting things by adding solar and batteries just on the low end. If they were to go, that's the simplest solution. We're going to add solar panels on the roof, batteries in the garage. and we have all our EVs like charging up whenever they want, you can see that, oh, I can charge up, I can fill up my batteries in the middle of the day with the solar panels and then wait for the vehicles to come at the end of the day. I've paid no money for that energy, but then I can turn around and charge the EV drivers their normal utility rate. So the EV drivers don't feel like they're getting squeezed. And so then you're starting to make some pretty significant profits as a property owner. So you're going to start to see that shift happen, I would say, over the next 5 years. That's 100% coming.
Yeah, I think especially in a market like California where energy rates are pretty high, there's a lot, even if you don't have solar panels, where you can just have a battery backup system that charges during kind of the low time of use and then either use that energy when it's more expensive. And I think exactly what you're talking about of still providing a value to the EV driver, but then there is that price difference. And so it just kind of gives a more levelized and predictable cost to the EV driver. But then as the building owner, there's definitely a financial advantage to it. One question, you mentioned V2G, and I agree with you, it's still early days, but is that something Pando Electric can support or is looking to support, or would that really require much for your system to be upgraded to have that kind of functionality? Because I mean, I'll be the first to admit right now there's no clear like standard for what even V2G is from the software side.
Right.
So I'm curious to see like how big of a thing it actually becomes, but I definitely personally would love to have some sort of system for that in my next home. But it really does seem to be just almost walled gardens between each automaker for that currently.
Yeah, I think much like EVs were adopted by single family homeowners first, V2G is going to be adopted by single family homeowners first. I think as we move down this path, the answer is 100% yes. Pando Electric's already looking into how to support those types of initiatives. The thing that I'm always concerned about with the apartment owners, apartment dwellers, is that the last thing you want is it's not coming off of your energy bill, it's coming off the building's energy bill. Yeah. So it's like, okay, well, I'm not getting any benefit. And then also my car might end up at went from 100% to 50%. And I'm like, oh, well, I didn't get anything for that. And my car has less energy in it. That kind of seems like a lose-lose. So there are some initiatives going on like, oh, well, you get paid back for the energy, or demand response is going to be the first big one for the apartment communities, where they'll be able to just shut off the chargers when they're seeing peak demand to prevent like a rolling blackout. Those types of things are really, really interesting. I think those are going to come. That's going to be here very, very soon, like in the next year or two, especially for California. But 100%, I think V2G is coming. It's something that Pando Electric has looked into. We couldn't support it today with our current setup. It's just an outlet, so there's no inverter or anything that can push power back out or pull power back in. So those things need to kind of be sorted out and thought through. And I think the biggest one is really that reservoir that I do feel that that's something you do need in the apartment community, is a place where the power goes that's localized, not just dump it back into the grid. Yeah, there's a really great book called The Grid. It kind of outlines all the issues with the American electrical infrastructure, and it outlines just like why doing that doesn't solve many problems. It actually creates a lot more. So you'd rather have it go to a place where it's going to sit and get stored rather than I'm going to just send it back out into the grid, because then you're just like, where does it go? Because the one thing,
especially if you're already in a blackout, it's really not going to do anything other than just become wasted, kind of.
Right, they have to just dump it, and that's one of the things that people don't understand, is that for a lot of us, electricity is like almost magical. I just push a button in my home, the lights all come on. That's like true magic. The thing is that it's actually the world's largest machine that we've built here. The minute I push that button, the energy generated has to be created that second, so it has to be instantaneous. So that's something that, like, in general, like when you think about it, it is mind-blowing that we've had this system around for so long, and that's how it works. But you can't just dump the power back in and be like, it'll go somewhere else. I'm like, well, no, somebody needs to have the ability to use that power at that moment.
For sure. And you actually brought up a really interesting thing that we've talked about on this podcast a bit before around V2G, is you mentioned an inverter, and you have some automakers who are essentially backfitting with, it would be DC that comes out, and others that are kind of going AC, and it kind of just depends on the automaker. It seems like for your product, and generally the less expensive option is if it puts out AC. But then, like you're saying, depending on how you want to store that and then use that, and especially in a multifamily situation, you probably would need to convert it anyway. And then if you do the AC output, it just it's not a huge cost, but then technically it is more on the vehicle purchase you're making. I think there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of still the rainbow and sparkles and kind of sunshine stage of it, where it's like, oh, it's all good and all promises and nothing bad can happen. But now we're kind of getting to that other side, like, okay, it's a great vision. How do we execute this and kind of make it practical? And there's still, I think every day it just seems, which is kind of a good thing because it's getting solved, but it just seems like there is another kind of hurdle and thing to logistically work through on the technology, unfortunately.
But I've always said to people that we're still in the very early stages of this technology. Like,
right.
This is not
exactly. Not even just V2G.
This is not mature at all.
Right.
This is, the earliest stages. And so there's a lot of really amazing innovations that are going to come. I often tell people, like, think about when the automobile first became mass market and how different it became over the next, 50 years. And that's where that's what we're walking towards. It's like a very, very different future than we're at right now. There probably is going to be a lot of vehicle to grid solutions. There is going to be a lot more batteries. There's going to be different types of, scenarios where stuff that I can't even think about is going to exist.
Right.
So I'm honestly super excited for the future of this. It's going to create a shit ton of jobs right. Because we're now in a totally new world of having to reorg our entire grid around bringing the transportation sector on top of our already electrical infrastructure for our families and housing and stuff like that. So merging those two things together is causing a lot of problems right now. But I always, in the startup world, those actually problems create solutions. So these
right.
problems are going to create something really unique and hopefully quite wonderful for the world. I have seen it the other way go around, but that's where my optimism comes in. It's like, this is going to be, I'm really excited. I think it's going to be an amazing future. And V2G is just one of those really amazing innovations that's going to happen.
No, I think that's, I agree with you. I don't want to sound cynical. I think it's easy to be about that kind of in the moment, but the more you look to the future and stuff, there is a lot to be optimistic about it. So, Joseph, I think it's best to end it on a positive note there and looking at the future. But I guess for anyone listening, what's the best way to get a hold of you or learn more about Pando Electric?
Yeah, pandoelectric.com is the best place to learn about the company. You can reach me at joseph.nagle@pandoelectric.com. I love to talk about electric vehicles. I love to talk about building a new grid. So reach out to me with any questions you have.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joseph. We'll have to have you back on soon. This has really been a pleasure because I know, like I said, we get so many questions and people want to know more about Level 2. And I think it's really great what you guys are bringing to the space. So thanks so much for coming on today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And I would love to come back anytime.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Grid Connections podcast. We hope you gain valuable insights with our conversation with Joseph Nagle, the head of corporate strategy at Pando Electric. If you're interested in the future of EV charging solutions, especially for multi-tenant facilities like apartments and condos, this episode was packed with crucial information, and don't forget to check out Pando Electric's website at pandoelectric.com to learn more and speak with the team there. As we discussed, the partnership between Pando Electric and Peninsula Clean Energy is leading the charge in making electric vehicle charging more affordable and accessible. From reducing installation costs to improving grid stability, these innovations are crucial for the continued growth of EV adoption. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with at least one other person who might benefit from these insights too. Also, don't forget to leave a positive review on our podcast page. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners who are passionate about clean energy and electric vehicles. Thanks again for tuning in, and until next week, this is the Grid Connections podcast signing off.